The stale smell of the waiting room did nothing to quell the nausea in my stomach. I looked around and then sank to my feet, wondering what I was really doing here. To my left sat my beautiful wife, Rachel. She looked as radiantly beautiful as ever, which left me with no butterflies. To my right sat my daughter, Jasmine, who in many ways was my savior. My thoughts went back to the day I met each of them. I was a very different person then. Mr. Green, called a voice back into the room. We'll be ready to receive you in about 20 minutes. The second witness has just taken the witness stand. I nodded. For the first time in a year, I was face to face with my ex-wife. The woman I had been married to for 12 years of my life, but a lot had changed since then. I'll start with the day my life changed forever. It was an ordinary spring day in Albany, New York. I was coming home from my job at the local Albany utility company. I hated the job, and I was practically forced into it by Jessica, my ex-wife. She said, "It's more reliable and financially beneficial." The next comment was usually, "It's better than construction." I should have known sooner that she seemed to care only about money and social status. I don't want to say much about Jessica, but at 35 years old, she was still the most beautiful girl in the world to me. She was smart, funny, and loved me to death from the moment we met. I always thought she was beyond me. When we met, I was working construction in the Bronx. I was tall and quite good-looking, with a permanent tan from being outdoors all the time. From the moment we started dating, we were always together. I was her protector, entertained her, and she didn't notice my lack of learning and seemed to love me with even more passion. When she finished her master's degree, we moved back to her hometown of Albany and eventually married. Her parents were not at all enamored of me, oh no, and they made no attempt to hide their dislike. Both they and her old friends thought she was too good for me and wondered why she should marry beneath her. In her father's words, I was a handsome dullard. Nevertheless, we were happy and loved each other more than anything else in the world. I was an only child and both my parents died in my late teens, so Jessica became my whole world to me. I found a job in construction, and Jessica got a very good job in a finance company owned by a friend of her father's. When the recession hit in '08, I lost my job, and only Jessica's paycheck got us through the bad times. This only resulted in her parents hating me even more, if that's even possible. It couldn't help but affect our marriage. I guess that's what it's supposed to be like when the people you love and socialize with tell you that your husband is a loser. Unfortunately, it also affected my friendships back home in the Bronx. In their opinion, I was now rotating in different circles. Of course, my best friend Joey was always there for me. He was more like a brother to me, and his family helped me through the loss of my own parents. It was Jessica who managed to convince me to get a job at the utility company. Like I said, I hated it. Locked rooms, computers, talking to people on the phone in a fake voice. I imagined hell, but for Jessica's sake and for ours, I went for it. We both hoped to have children someday, but for Jessica, it was more important to have a successful career and be visible. I didn't care about image, wealth, or status, but I did everything Jessica wanted me to do, and even tried to be everything Jessica wanted me to be. Unfortunately, when you stop being yourself, things go downhill and you end up being an unhappy person. I was no longer that fun-loving construction worker from the Bronx who loved to have fun and be around people. I became depressed, gained weight, stopped looking after myself, and rarely socialized, if at all. Yes, I was an obese office worker married to a successful financial analyst who attended fancy dinners and cocktail parties with Albany's elite. I wasn't one of them, they knew it, and I knew it. As I pulled up to our house, I was surprised to see Jessica's car in the garage. I got out of the car and walked toward the house with a sense of impending dread. I don't know why, but when I entered the kitchen, Jessica was sitting at the table with a solemn but confident look. She had some papers in front of her, and just as I was about to speak, she interrupted me. "Mikey, we need to talk." Those famous words came down on me like the impact of a brick. I could see that she was a little nervous, but when I sat up, I didn't see any tears. "What's wrong, baby?" I asked. "Is everything okay?" She tensed, cleared her throat as if preparing for a big speech. "I'm sorry, Michael, but I want a divorce," she stated clearly and calmly. My heart dropped and my stomach knotted. I was speechless, as if someone had reached into my chest and grabbed my heart. This terrible feeling of sudden loss, which I had experienced twice already, was the worst feeling imaginable, spreading through my body like a virus. I looked at her and said with a tremor in my voice, Why? I stuttered. I fell in love with someone else, she said, looking at me without the slightest sign of pity. I was shattered, but strangely enough, I didn't feel overwhelmed. The old Mikey Green could wreak havoc, but he no longer existed. Jessica made sure of that. I was just a shell of the man I used to be, and here she was, finishing me off with one last swing of her sword. How long? I said hoarsely. 4 months, she said, and I just stared at her. But now I want us to be together and get married, she declared without thought for my feelings. I was looking at a woman I no longer recognized, and she in turn was looking at a man she no longer recognized. I don't want to know the details, but I want to know why, I said finally, afraid she would answer. She didn't waste any time answering. Just look at yourself, Mikey. You're not the man I married. You're overweight. You've been unshaven for years. And the last time you got a decent haircut or bought new clothes? She said this in a burst of feelings that must have been building up inside her for a long time. You're a shell of the man I fell in love with, and let's be honest, you've never been on my intellectual level, have you? She said in a mocking tone. God knows how many times in the last decade I've had to defend you to your parents, friends, and coworkers. Justify to them why we got married in the first place. She continued, and I suddenly wondered where the girl I'd fallen in love with had disappeared to, and who this heartless creature sitting in front of me was. And Rich, my new man is younger than you, fit, handsome, has a successful business and a big house near Mom and Dad in Loudonville. Each new word she uttered was like a dagger piercing my body. Do I know him? I asked meekly. He runs a gardening company that operates in the area. He's a sole proprietor now, but we want to expand the business together, she added when I fell silent. She finally finished and sat there, waiting for another question, no doubt to annoy me even more. When I stopped talking, she slid the papers toward me. Dad and his lawyer helped me draw up the divorce papers. I think it's a good deal for you. Since I paid off most of the mortgage, Dad recommended a 70/30th split of the house in my favor, which we'll be able to sell since I'll be moving in with Rich. I just stared at her and she continued. I think a 50/50th split of our savings would be fair, and I won't be seeking alimony, although I'm sure I could fight for something if I wanted to. Now I understood the arrogance and malice in her voice. How had I missed it all these years? I felt like a fool, and she seemed to think I'd always been one. Let's be honest, Mikey, I make a lot more money than you and my new man makes a lot too, so I won't touch your 401k if you sign the papers and don't fight me for anything. She suddenly stopped talking when I looked her straight in the eye. She must have seen a glimpse of the old Mikey because she swallowed hard. I took the pen and signed my name to 12 years of marriage. Getting up from the table, I went to our bedroom, gathered my things, and came back. She was sitting at the table reading papers while I walked past her, through the door and out of her life. What did she say? Joey shouted. Is she crazy? To me, Joey is my family, and unfortunately, I have neglected him over the past few years. But like true brothers, we can overlook misbehavior and will always be there for each other in times of need. As we talked about what had happened, I could hear someone in the background trying to silence Joey. Is that Helen? I asked. What is she saying? Yes, Mikey, she said good riddance to the stuck-up bitch. Joey and Helen had what you call no filter. What you see is what you get, and how I missed that. That's how I used to be. Hey, Mikey, I have an acquaintance of Helen's who does debtor investigations for local companies. I can have him check this guy out for you. You know, check to see if the asshole is legit and all that, he asked in his usual boorish manner. I don't care, buddy, I said dejectedly. This guy cheats on you, takes your wife away, and you just sit there and accept it. Mikey, she's really turned you into a sucker, he said, raising his voice. Damn, that hurt, and Joey must have realized it too. Sorry, bro, I'm just mad as hell and I wish you were too, he apologized. It's all right, Joey. I mean, you're right and all. Do what you want, I said. I gave him the few pieces of information I had about this new guy. He was a gardener in the neighborhood, so it wasn't hard to get more information if Helen's boyfriend wanted it. You need to get back in the game, Mikey, and get back to being your old self again, he instructed before we hung up. I hung up the phone and lay on my bed in the cheap motel, staring at the fan whirring under the ceiling. My head was spinning, and I was trying to make sense of everything that had happened in my life, not just in the last few hours, but in the last 12 years. I couldn't sleep, so I grabbed the bottle of Jack Daniels on the table and drank from it. For the next few weeks, I did the same thing. Often, I would call in sick to work, or show up drunk and smelling of alcohol, causing me to be sent home. Everyone in the office would stare at me. There would be snide comments behind my back, and I felt like I was watching myself from the sidelines, just continuing to exist. I was recommended to see a doctor, and although it helped, being let off work gave me more time to think and reflect on the past. I never made it to the Jones and Brown office to file my divorce. A letter was sent to my office because no one knew where I was, and no one was going to look for me. This I knew for sure. The letter contained the divorce decree and a check for $175,000. That was my share of the house, savings, and household assets. The settlement agreement spelled out everything Jessica had said at the kitchen table, and since I wasn't present at the meeting, it was executed in absentia. I had no idea how legal it all was or if it was legal, but I didn't have it in me to fight. Not enough for Jessica and her powerful entourage anyway. It's been a month since Jessica told me she wanted a divorce, and I finally cashed the check that came into my account. I discovered that all of our other accounts were closed, and Jessica had removed her name from our joint account. However, I was walking aimlessly toward the exit of the bank when I heard a voice calling my name. I didn't pay attention to it at first, but when I turned to look, I saw Pete and Shelley, my old neighbors. "Hey, Michael," Pete asked as he approached me. "Sorry to hear about the divorce," he said nervously. Now Shelley, his wife, was a nosy neighbor and loved to gossip, and it didn't take her long to blab. "I can't believe Jessica left you so quickly and remarried." I looked at her in surprise. I think I remember Jessica saying that she wanted to marry this guy, but I was in such a state of mind at the time that I'd forgotten about it. "Oh, you didn't know?" Shelley continued. "I had no idea," I said with indifference. "We thought you guys were the real deal." Peter said, "And then we saw that she was married to this Richard Walton." It was the first time I'd heard his full name. But when I looked at Shelley, she seemed to recoil and crinkle at the mere mention of his name. I didn't pay any attention to it because I suddenly thought that now I had a last name to give to Joey's friend, not the gardener Rich from Albany. "He was the gardener who maintains your neighborhood," I said, offering information I hadn't been asked for. At that moment, I saw Peter turn around and meet his gaze with Shelley, who by this point had turned bright red. "Our gardener," he called out to Shelley, attracting glances from passers-by. "Why did you turn red, Shells?" he asked when I realized I had hit a snag. "No, Peter, no, never," Shelley pleaded. "He tried that with me once and I put him in his place." Peter was already blushing and looking rather annoyed, and Shelley continued on. "He's a creep, and every time he's supposed to come, I go away for hours to avoid him." "I never told you because I knew you'd be angry," she said, reaching for his hand and looking at him pleadingly. "We need to talk," he said, and then turned to me and apologized. He grabbed her hand and led her down the sidewalk. Looks like this is one lost customer for Jessica and Richard's growing empire, I thought to myself, and managed to smile for the first time in a while. The news of the marriage hit me hard. I fell back into depression and reached for the bottle again. I thought I should try to drink myself to death. Then all the pain would go away and I wouldn't have to continue my meaningless existence. The next morning, I got out of my motel bed and collapsed on the floor, dousing myself with sweat. I had officially hit rock bottom. On my hands and knees, I crawled to the shower where cold water poured over me. When I got out of the shower, I looked in the mirror, and what was reflected in it shocked me. "Screw you!" I shouted to the man looking back at me. "I need to get better." I fell to my knees and cried for the first time since my mom died. "I just want to be happy," I shouted into my hands. I knew something had to change. The following Monday, I walked into my office and got to work. For some reason, my personal mail was on my desk. I guessed it had been diverted there because no one knew where I lived. Going through mostly junk, I found a flyer for a local gym that promised to get anyone in shape in 12 weeks. I snorted, thinking it would take longer than that. But I thought, what the hell, maybe this is the change I need. That evening, as I entered the gym, I had no idea what the beautiful young instructor standing in front of me would think of this old man. At 38, I felt like an 80-year-old man. But when I got closer to her, she extended her graceful hand, which I gladly accepted. "I'm Jasmine," she said. To say she thought I was inept would be an understatement. But in her beautiful brown eyes, I saw a semblance of hope. They seemed to infuse me with some kind of energy. Not lust or anything romantic, but honesty and compassion. So for the next week, I managed to move out of the motel and negotiate a lease on a small studio apartment in town and close to the gym. I decided to focus on my 12-week plan and see where life would take me. I needed to lose about 50 pounds, and the best place to start was by getting rid of all the unopened liquor bottles among my belongings. For the next month, I worked very hard. My life consisted of nothing but work and the gym. Joey and Helen also managed to visit me a few times, no doubt to check on me. But by the end of the month, and with Jasmine's constant support, I had already lost 14 pounds. The fact that I spent almost every day at the gym was good in that I got to know Jasmine much better. One evening after class, she agreed to have coffee with me, and I learned a little bit about her life. She was raised by a single mom and went to community college to become a fitness trainer and nutritionist. She definitely knew her stuff, and I grew to like her even more. I told her about my recent divorce and my former life in the Bronx. I admitted to her that I had hit rock bottom before I joined the gym and met her. I tried hard not to sound like some desperate scumbag, but she was beyond her years in terms of compassion and emotional maturity. It wasn't until I got out of the shower a few sessions later and met her that I got a twitch. Jasmine was talking to a woman who looked like her sister at first glance. Corny, but true. Jasmine noticed my gaze and walked over to me before I could turn and walk away. "Michael, this is my mom, Rachel," Rachel said, smiling, extending her hand. Our eyes met and I felt a rush of embarrassment wash over me. My stomach churned and I was speechless. The silence grew more and more awkward. "That means he likes you, Mum," said Jasmine, laughing and saving me in the process. "But he's quiet when he likes someone," she added as if she'd known me all my life. The truth is, I wasn't always a quiet, shy, and unassuming person. Years of emotional abuse, I now believe, will do that to you. Jasmine left to gather her things, and Rachel and I started talking. When Jasmine returned, she invited me to dinner across the street. I was hesitant at first, but her insistence made it hard to refuse. I imagined that if she had a father, she would have circled him. At dinner, Rachel was so warm and sweet. I realized that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and as the evening went on, I relaxed in their company. There was no need to put on a show or act flashy with them. They weren't people who thought they were better than others. Rachel joked around a lot, and that put me at ease. We touched on our past in passing, and I guessed that Jasmine had brought her mother up to speed on my life. I felt better that night than I had in months or even years. I even still had Rachel's number in my phone after she agreed, or more correctly, insisted on finally dealing with the mess on my top of my head. At first, I was reluctant to agree, but since Rachel was a hairdresser, I capitulated. This elicited the sweetest laugh I'd ever heard from a woman. For the next few months, Rachel and I were inseparable. When we finally made love, the passion was strong and loving, and it was perfect every time. From then on, all I could think about was her, and finally my heart ached for another woman. I knew we should take it slow because I didn't want her to think she was some sort of offspring of Jessica. We wanted to make sure our feelings for each other were real. We had both been hurt in our lives, so trust was very important to both of us. Eventually, I took her to my hometown where Joey and Helen immediately fell in love with her. One evening, Helen took me aside in the kitchen and said, "That's the woman for you, Mikey. Don't let her go." I assured her there was no chance of that. "Really?" "I don't believe you. 180 pounds. "Really?" I said excitedly. "Yes, 180 exactly," Jasmine confirmed. "You're back to your ideal weight." "Dad," she said, laughing at her new name for me. I was so proud of myself and so grateful to Jasmine and Rachel for helping me get to this point. My new haircut, as well as giving up my beard, must have contributed to some of the weight loss, I thought. Rachel had convinced me once to try a clean shave so she could see my face. I laughed at the suggestion. I just hoped she wouldn't be scared off by the person hiding behind the mask. Fortunately, she wasn't. And here I was on cloud 9. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had accomplished what I set out to do. I looked great and felt great, and that was the mindset I had when I was working construction in New York. I got to Rachel's house feeling on top of the world. When I walked through the door, I was greeted by a nervous and pale Rachel. The look of concern on her face gave me a sense of déjà vu. "What's wrong, baby?" I asked nervously. I had a bad feeling again. "We need to talk," she said. Suddenly, I felt like the walls had closed in around me. The familiar sensations returned, and nausea came to my senses. "Okay," I said as Rachel took my hand and sat me down. "Look, Rachel, if you're going to break up with me, do it quickly so I can get out of here," I said sharply as she recoiled in shock. "No, honey," she replied, squeezing my hand tighter and pulling me a little closer. "I don't know how to say this because I don't want you to be mad at me." The feeling of terror did not abate. "I'm pregnant," she announced hesitantly. I was shocked. We were silent for a few seconds while her beautiful face crinkled, trying to gauge my reaction. I rose to my feet and stepped back a few steps. I turned to her again, looking worried and on the verge of tears. I screamed at the full power of my lungs, simultaneously jumping into the air with my fists raised. Her face brightened, and joy flashed in her eyes again. "You're not angry?" She smiled her beautiful smile again. "How can I be mad? I'm going to be a dad," I announced, before I wrapped her in my arms and kissed her passionately on the lips. For the next 5 minutes, we hugged each other. I was the happiest man on earth. Over the next few days, Rachel, Jasmine, and I started looking for a house. Although Rachel had very little savings, I had almost $180,000 in the bank, which was more than enough to buy a house. It took less than a week to find a beautiful 5-bedroom colonial home in Pine Hills. It was in need of renovation, which deterred other buyers, but I, with my construction experience, was excited about its potential. Our offer was accepted, which meant we didn't need to take out a mortgage. The day we moved into our new home, I got down on one knee and proposed to Rachel. I knew it was quick, but I loved her very much, and she was the one for me. She said yes, and I'd love to say we've lived happily ever after ever since, but that would miss the point of why I'm sitting here in this courthouse. Just to make it clear that I wasn't being accused of anything. A couple weeks after moving into our new house, I got a call from Joey. It was crushing, to say the least. I had completely forgotten about the fact that Joey had asked Helen's coworker to check out my ex-wife's new husband, and frankly, so had Joey. If it went on for months, I had no idea what it would cost me, and frankly, I didn't even want to know what he'd figured out. Nevertheless, Joey was beyond excited, and just had to tell me his findings. I was silent as Joey began to speak. "It's all a house of cards, Mikey," he said, laughing. "Helen's boyfriend dug it all up, and after you gave your full name, things came to a head. Turns out the IRS and the feds got involved." "Wait, what?" I shouted, thinking I had missed most of the story. "What do you mean the feds are involved?" "Just listen, Mikey, just listen to it," he said, trying to calm me down. "The gardening company he owns has Jessica as a director, and it's mired in debt, Mikey. I mean serious debt, and that's just for starters. The house he owns now, the deed lists Jessica's name on it, and it's worth over $1 million, but the mortgage payments are made through a company called Richwall Enterprises. That company owns both the house and the business. Jessica and Richard are listed as joint co-owners, and the trade only started 6 months ago, probably right after they got married. I was struggling to keep up, and I knew Joey was struggling to convey what Helen had obviously said to him. Helen's boyfriend alerted the IRS, who, by the way, will be paying his bill. I was happy to hear that I wouldn't have to pay a huge bill. However, the IRS investigated Richard Walton and found out that he was on their wanted list. They had a picture of him or something. "So he's a crook," I said, stating the obvious. "Oh yeah, Mikey, but wait until you hear what happened next," he said, teasing me. "This investigation has gotten the attention of some major corporation in Charlotte." "North Carolina?" interjected I. "His name is Davis Nolan, and he has a daughter named Julia Reed. She currently lives separately from her husband, Kyle Reed. They have 2 children and—" By this point, I was seriously puzzled. "Get to it, Joey," I said with annoyance. "Hold on to me, kid," he said, panting. "Turns out Kyle Reed is Richard Walton." "What?" I yelled into the phone, and Joey's ear rang. Not that he cared. He was too busy laughing his ass off. "Yeah, and they're still legally married. I think they call him a bigamist or something, but that's not the best," he said, leaving me hanging. It was starting to sound like a Hollywood movie or something. The FBI got involved in the case, and it turns out this guy is a two-time felon. He did time for drugs and burglary. Mr. Nolan managed to get a reduced sentence on the second conviction. Apparently, he's a powerful man. Anyway, the feds investigated, and this Kyle Richard guy contacted another suspect they were looking for in connection with drug trafficking offenses. My thoughts returned to Jessica and her friends and family. I imagined their faces at the sight of this news. I started to smile. That's not all, Mikey. The FBI and the IRS joined forces and got this guy. They found him in a warehouse near his home, and the answer to how a man mired in debt could afford $1 million house and a lavish lifestyle became all too clear. Like Joey, how? I was hooked. They found heroin, ecstasy, and stolen goods in his apartment and truck. They think he was going to run away again. There were suitcases full of clothes and things in his truck. I started laughing, and Rachel joined me on the couch, shaking her head and laughing too. She had no idea what she was laughing at or what made me so happy. So what about Jessica? I asked, and Rachel turned around and stared at me. I put my hand on the tube and whispered to her. You're not going to believe this, I said, shaking my head and leaving her hanging. Joey kept talking as I brought the phone to my ear. She's been arrested. Her parents have somehow managed to keep it from the media, but I expect it to make the front pages in the next few days. After all, it's big news, he said. I think Joey was more excited than I was, because honestly, any feelings I had for Jessica, sick or not, were gone. I reached for Rachel's hand and squeezed it to confirm that fact. When I finished talking, I eagerly turned to Rachel and told her everything. She was shocked and surprised, because even though she knew Jessica was a complete bitch, it had never occurred to her that she could be a criminal. All I could think about was what her parents, family, and the so-called social elite thought of her. Poor old daddy has a daughter who is a deluded criminal, and that can't be unliked at the country club. I laughed to myself, and Rachel realized what I was thinking and laughed with me. Within days, the story was on the front page of every newspaper in the county and on every news channel. Apparently, Jessica's parents were still influential in the community because she was barely mentioned. Sure, the bigamist and drug-dealing crook was all over our screens, but the name of the accomplice, who revolved in the elite circles of society and was well known in the corporate financial world, was not mentioned. Not a week later, however, a newspaper published a picture of both of them, with prisoner numbers, but without mentioning Jessica's name. But we learned that Kyle Reed was actually 41 years old, not 35 as he claimed. So my ex-wife really did leave me for an elderly criminal who had just ruined her life. Maybe she wasn't as smart as she thought she was. I was shocked by the image of my ex-wife. I had to look closely to recognize her. She looked like a shadow of the confident and arrogant woman who had left me almost 8 months ago. She was gaunt and looked like she had aged. Her hair was thinning and there were huge dark bags under her eyes. I looked up and saw my beautiful pregnant fiancée who looked the complete opposite. I felt like the luckiest person in the world. Not only that I had her, but that I could get rid of my ex and her family. In the months that followed, the topic quieted down. We had our first family Christmas in the new house. Rachel's parents came to visit. Helen and Joey stopped by, and I was surprised to see that a few of my old friends from the construction days were back in touch. They loved Rachel too, and they were the ones who talked me into getting back into construction. Rachel and Jasmine agreed with them, and that's another reason I love them. In the new year, I quit my job and became self-employed. I worked on construction sites and also did small jobs around the neighborhood. Ironically, I also started getting a lot of requests for gardening work in several neighborhoods. I was even surprised when I was contacted by Peter and Shelley, but only if I promised I wouldn't try anything with Shelley. They got my word on it. In March, Rachel gave birth to our mixed twins, Alex and Sophia. In April, we were married in a small ceremony in Albany. It had been a little over a year since my divorce from Jessica, and it's scary to even think about how much had happened in that time. Sadly, however, that wasn't the last time I saw her. My new perfect life was going so well until a visitor knocked on my door quite unexpectedly. His name was Andrew Brown from the law firm of Jones and Brown, who was defending Miss Jessica Walker in an upcoming lawsuit. I was surprised that she reverted to her maiden name. Of course, Mom and Dad wouldn't like it if Walker's good name was smeared in the proverbial mud. As he spoke, Mr. Brown made himself comfortable in my house. We would like you to provide a certificate of good character for Jess. That is Miss Walker, he asked bluntly. I laughed. Why would I do that? I replied. Well, before the divorce, you knew Miss Walker better than anyone else. You knew she was straight and would never get involved in anything criminal, right? I don't know if he was asking or telling me. But even I could see where he was going with this. What if he refuses? A voice behind me asked suddenly. Rachel came down the stairs, obviously having overheard our conversation. Mr. Brown looked at me. Like my wife said, I offered. We can get a subpoena and force you to attend. If you still don't show up, we can charge you and put you in jail, he said in a threatening tone. My first reaction was to punch him in the face and throw him headfirst out the door. But as I looked at my wife, I realized I had too much to lose. I had no idea if what he said was right or if it was even legal, but for the sake of one court date, I agreed to his demands. It was easier that way. So here I sit in the waiting room of the courthouse. The trial has been going on for several days, and as my statement approaches, I turn to Rachel. What shall I say, dear? I asked in a whisper. She took my hand, looked at me with her beautiful brown eyes, and said, You're the most honest and loving man I've ever known. Just be honest. I knew that what I said in court would probably have no effect on the case. My ex-wife's lawyers forced me to attend the trial. They wrongly assumed that I would speak highly of her. This could have been the biggest mistake of their lives, because I had no intention of doing any such thing. A few days ago, the trial of Kyle Reed was completed. He was found guilty of Class E bigamy, a federal charge of possession of Schedule I drugs with intent to supply, perjury, handling stolen property, and a host of charges related to defrauding the U.S. government. In addition, he received a third sentence. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Even I was shocked by that sentence. However, in an attempt to get a lesser sentence, he charged Jessica with fraud and handling stolen goods. He claimed she was involved because they started a holding company right after they got married. What's the saying, no honor among thieves? The theft charges were contested, but in the fraud case, the IRS put her on the hook. Mr. Green, we're ready for you, the bailiff announced. I rose to my feet and exhaled noisily. Rachel had gone to the gallery, and Jasmine was watching the twins in the waiting room. They were sound asleep, oblivious to what was happening. My name was announced in court, and as I approached the podium, I felt the stares of everyone present. It was a strange atmosphere. There were a few sighs as I spoke, especially from those sitting behind the defendant. As I took the oath of office, I turned to face the hall and saw Jessica in the flesh for the first time in a year. She was dressed in an orange prison uniform, and she was surrounded on either side by an expensive defense team. She was looking at her feet, but I turned my attention to her parents and then to a few of her friends who were sitting behind her. I singled out a couple people who looked at me and muttered the word, wow. The irony of now looking down on them from the witness stand never left me. I had spent our entire marriage with all of them looking down on me. Now the roles have reversed. Andrew Brown rose to his feet and began to speak. Thank you for coming today, Mr. Green, he said. Well, I had no choice, Mr. Brown, I replied, looking down at him. He recoiled at my tone, and all eyes turned to him to see what he would answer. At that moment, Jessica finally lifted her head and looked in my direction. Her eyes went wide and her jaw dropped. She suddenly burst into tears, causing everyone to turn around and look at her. The realization must have come over her. The man she had fallen in love with was back, and the man she had destroyed was gone. She was inconsolable, and the judge asked her lawyer if he needed a break. He ignored his suggestion and continued. Mr. Green, as the defendant's ex-husband, whom my client admittedly treated very well during the divorce, would you agree that the charges against her surprise even you? He asked, meeting no objection from the prosecutor. I was very shocked. But as far as being nice about divorce, I think you and I have different ideas about that, I replied confidently, as a murmur was heard from behind him. I'm pretty sure I saw Jessica's parents talking to someone on the team as Jessica continued to sob. Okay, Mr. Green, but would you say that in all the time you and the defendant have been together, she has always been an honest, hard-working, and law-abiding citizen? He asked. Well, she cheated on me for 4 months with a man she said was younger, more attractive, and more successful, so we probably have our own definitions of honesty, I replied. I was beginning to think that at this point her legal team realized they may have made a mistake. Remember, he was only threatening me to show up, not painting a picture of a perfect innocent woman. I was just being honest, like Rachel said. But agree that you neglected yourself physically and intellectually during that time so that when someone better came along, you could blame the accused for leaving, he said sharply. There was an almost universal chorus of disapproving groans coming from the gallery and the prosecution bench, who obviously felt they were not really needed at this stage. The defense was digging my ex-wife's grave. The judge announced the order, giving me a chance to consider my response. I agree that I neglected certain aspects of my life. It was very hard to live with someone who controlled my life and whose family and friends considered you beneath them. The defendant's father once called me a sympathetic dumbass, I said openly, and the look of shock and confusion among the defense attorneys was too funny for words. At this point, Jessica just looked at me with pity in her eyes. I didn't feel anything for her in return. Perhaps, Mr. Green, but there is nothing to indicate that the defendant ever engaged in criminal activity. No evidence that during your years together, she was dishonest or sought to commit fraud. She paid her bills, even yours for a while, and never broke the law. Is that so? He said, visibly agitated. Objection. The prosecutor rose to her feet. This is inadmissible, Your Honor. The witness is not here to prove that the defendant didn't commit the crime. This is a waste of the court's time. Sustained, the judge said. The defense may rephrase the question. Mr. Brown looked puzzled, but cleared his throat and continued his questioning. Mr. Green, during the years you were together, the defendant was an honest person, paid all her bills, taxes, and mortgage. At one time, she even paid yours, is that correct? He stated. Yes, I said, but I have no idea what kind of person she's been for the last year. Well, I guess we can guess, I said. Objection, Mr. Brown said, looking at the judge. What do you mean objection, Mr. Brown? He's your witness, the judge said, trying not to laugh as half the courtroom erupted in laughter. The jury had to look away. Your Honor, it's obvious he's an embittered ex-husband seeking revenge on the woman who dumped him and moved on, he said, starting to get angry and annoyed. The defense team was now beyond excited. Jessica looked back at her parents and lawyer, tears streaming down her face. The judge spoke again. If he's an embittered ex-husband, why did you call him in for questioning? The prosecution team just sat back and smiled at each other. Is it true that you are really an embittered man who just wants to see his ex-wife suffer? Asked Mr. Brown after some silence. If this had happened 11 months ago, you might have been right. But now I have nothing to grieve about. I may not be a very smart man, Your Honor, but I'm an honest man. You're welcome, Mr. Green. Your wife. Mr. Brown's ex-wife, I interjected. Okay. Your ex-wife left you for another man and you feel no bitterness or anger toward her and her family? He asked. No. Like I said, 11 months ago, you could probably guess that. But since then, I've found the most beautiful woman in the world, I said, looking across the gallery and directly at Rachel. People followed my gaze until all eyes were on her. She lifted me up, put me back together, and now I can call her my wife. She gave me 3 beautiful children. We have great friends, a wonderful family, a beautiful home, and a successful business. Who in the world could be bitter about all that? I stated, without taking my eyes off my beautiful wife, and the smile never left my lips. She just looked at me with a beaming smile and nodded her head. I turned around and saw that the defense looked tense, and Jessica's parents were looking at their hands. Jessica looked confused and sobbed as she caught my gaze. I whispered the words, "Thank you," to her, and she collapsed on the table, hugging herself. I was fired, and I went back to my family. As I walked through the door, I heard a loud commotion with Jessica at the center of it. She was yelling, "Sorry, I love you." But whether it was directed at me, I don't know, and frankly, I didn't care. Jessica was found guilty of conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. Apparently, the court felt that Kyle Reed was not smart enough to do it alone. I read that it was Sections 18, 371-26, 7,201, and 7,206, 1 and 2. I had no idea what that meant. She was also found guilty of 5th-degree possession of stolen goods, which is apparently a Class A misdemeanor. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison. It also meant that any chance of pursuing a career in finance after her eventual release was gone forever. For us, life is beautiful. The twins are growing every day and their smiles can disperse the clouds on even the gloomiest day, which I'm happy to say is not many. My business is thriving, and even Rachel now has a few clients who come to our home for hair and beauty treatments. Jasmine has no problem going to her last year of college, which, by the way, I am now paying for. It's the least I can do for her after all, she saved my life. The end. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.